And a warm welcome. And welcome everybody to this session in this little series of Move to Cloud ERP, a practical guide. And as Krena already teased, I will focus today on the topic of CleanCore, let's say from a holistic point of view. My name is Lukas. I'm a consultant with SAP. I'm now with SAP now for roughly 18 years. And in the last few years, my main topic was around or is around development. How do companies implement their own extensions into ECC, S4 systems? How do you get your custom code into S4? All of that. And the main question behind was always, okay, how do we do it the right way? And this basically led to this concept of CleanCore. And in the last year, I also had the possibility to discuss with a lot more people, not only like extensibility guys like myself, around the concept of CleanCore. And we were working on a central definition, we can say, and I was part of that authoring team. And that's the idea, to give you today a bit more than just the marketing-ish overview on CleanCore is important. So that's my goal for the next roughly an hour. We will have some time in the end maybe for questions. That's at least the idea. What will I talk about? After a short intro, I will talk about, okay, what's basically the reason we want to be the fast one. You will see in a second what do I mean by that, and how to be the fast one in this kind of work. We will then, when we come from like, okay, this is the motivation, why to be clean, we'll then say, okay, what does it mean? What does CleanCore really mean? We will see that this is more than just modifications or more than just develop something on BTP. We have 5 dimensions that we will briefly dive into. If we would go into the details, it would take more than an hour. We could say it's more a day workshop then, but still, I want to focus a bit, maybe based on my biased background on extensibility in there, to give you a bit more deep dive in there to see that. And then we want to come back up to the surface more and to the overview to say like, okay, and how does it look like in reality? What's maybe the important pieces that you need to take with you for your project? Depending on where you are, how you want to move, there are different actions you can take. And I want then to close up with also showing, okay, what is out there. There's, for example, something very interesting out there in our Activate methodology. You could say brand new. When we had a comparable session more in the German user group area in German, this was not yet there. So this is something like brand new. So what are the typical challenges and why will we talk about the fast one? Basically, for companies looking at the IT systems, we have different challenges today that are now not general challenges, but this is focused on, okay, how does this motivate to use this concept of a CleanCore? We will come to what is a CleanCore in a second, but this is more the motivation. On the one hand side, we have, you could say, something that's breaking you down or slowing you down in your speed of innovation. That's your complexity. And it's not saying like, hey, you're complex and that's bad, because businesses are to some extent complex, and you have maybe your infrastructure set up, your systems set up in a way that they are not as easy to change as you want to be. But at the same time, you need to do this, because when we look at the right-hand side and in the middle, we have new technologies around. I guess everyone's talking about generative AI, ChatGPT, all of this. ChatGPT is now 18 months old, roughly. And I think it's around everywhere. And we have this kind of disruptive changes every now and then from a technology point of view, or right-hand side here from a business point of view. So we have seen all the disruptions in global supply chains, the political changes that we've seen. The world is maybe, at least living in Central Europe, not seeming as safe as it was maybe 10 years ago. So there is quite a change out there and you need to adapt. And this is kind of a contradicting statement. On the one hand side, you have complexity, a grown landscape. On the other hand side, you need to be quick because you need to change. And that's basically the motivation. You could say, and I guess this is a true statement that you see, even the old Greeks mentioned this, like everything is going faster and faster than ever before. True, it is, but this means that we see also a shift in paradigms. So what does it mean? When we look at a nice statement from the founder of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, he's a smart guy, and he mentioned, okay, what does it lead to in this new quick world where we are now in? It's not the big fish which eats the small fish, it's the fast fish which eats the slow fish. And that's basically what we see, that you can say maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, it took new entries to any market quite a long time, for example, to reach 1 million users. So Netflix needed roughly 3.5 years, whereas ChatGPT had this done in a few days, the first 1 million users. And this is where I think it's important. Of course, working with an ERP system in general is maybe not the cutting edge of being totally agile, but at the other hand, if you look at your systems, it's important to be the fast one. And that's why we think this CleanCore concept is important, because it helps you to be fast. When we look at our, let's say, limited world of enterprise software, there, this is a key part. Because, of course, you will have your system. So, for example, then an S/4HANA system or an ECC system. But it's important that you're kind of flexible with it and that you can adapt to the changing world outside there. For example, and Sapphire is just around the corner in the next few weeks, there will be shown quite a lot of new innovation coming from SAP directly, where you can use and leverage business AI, where maybe some generative AI is incorporated. And to leverage this, you need to be quick, because you need to be on a new version. And we all see this like in our Windows world, or if you're using a smartphone, your iOS, if it is Apple, will be updated every now and then. And this is basically the idea that we say, if we want to keep track of this kind of innovation that comes with our software out of the box, we need to be clean, because what we see is the reality is that we typically have upgrade cycles of 5 to 7 years, sometimes even more. And just remember, if you're now working on an ECC release, that's S4 started back in 2015. So we're talking maybe about software that was, from an innovation cycle, innovative 10 years ago. So all of the past 10 years of innovation coming from SAP, and we have tens of thousands of developers working on technical things like in our platform, in BTP, or in S4 on process innovation stuff. This is all not in there. So this is why I think it's important to say, okay, we want to be quick. And the technical answer to this, now we come back, I'm a technical consultant, is what we would say the CleanCore concept, or the idea. What does it mean? Clean means that your core system, you can see it a bit in the picture. In our case, we would say the S4 system is the core, or your ECC system, or maybe a combination of ECC, S4, whatever. Your system is the core. It's clean if it's up to date, documented, unmodified, consistent, efficient, and cloud compliant. And this is where all of this comes from this idea that we have quite a lot of cloud software out there. And whenever you use some cloud software, you are always on the newest version. It's not like that I can say, for example, to the Amazon storefront and like, but I want to have it look like 10 years ago or 5 years ago. No, if there's a new version, it's just there. Sometimes you have something like beta adopters or early adopters or stuff like that. But in general, if WhatsApp, for example, decides to change its layout and to have the buttons in a different way, it will be just there. The important thing is, or the good thing is, if there's a new function, it's automatically in there. It's not possible in our, let's say, private world to run on systems or on apps that are 10 years old. Of course, it's difficult to compare my personal MS Teams, WhatsApp, or whatever with the complexity of an S4 or ECC system. But that's why we think of it. For S4HANA Cloud Private Edition and on premises, this is very much important, because there you can even be unclean. An S/4HANA Cloud Public Edition system, so the public cloud version with maybe a smaller scope, is clean per definition, because there is no idea that you could say, yeah, I want to postpone my upgrade. I do it, I don't know, 5 years from now. No, there you're always on the newest release. Every 6 months, you get the newest version. And there, a lot of this kind of stability is built in. And that's the idea. So what does it mean then? And let's dive a bit deeper into what is it now, the CleanCore. And I admit, being a part of this definition team that we worked on last year, I was part of authoring this slide. And I have to admit, being a technician, the first sentence, CleanCore is the CleanCore concept is a mindset and philosophy, was a bit rough for me, because like, yeah, mindset and philosophy, it's not very precise. But let me tell you what the idea behind is, and then you will see why this is a perfect match to say it's a mindset and philosophy. It's the idea to work with your ERP system in a way as clean as possible, or you could say to be as cloud as possible. Act with your system as if it would be in public cloud. Maybe it's not. Maybe it will never be. Maybe it will only be like 20 years from now. Who knows? But act like it is. Because with this mindset and this idea, you always try to keep your core system clean. And what do we mean by clean? And this is like then what you can see here. It should be stable and upgrade safe. And if you do extensions and integration scenarios, and if you look at your processes, this should be all done in a transparent manner that you are then able to faster deploy new versions of software. Because that's basically the whole motivation to select. We want to be more flexible, more agile. We want to be capable to consume new innovation. Then this is kind of the key how to get there. At the same time, we know that there might be technical debt. And what do we mean by this technical debt is basically everything where you pay like a financial debt, where you kind of have to pay a price. Every extension that you create, every custom code that you create is basically technical debt, because there is a risk that in future you need to pay for adopting it. Even if it's not at all coupled to SAP, some of us might remember the Log4j issue, where everyone was thought like, that's a stable piece of software, I can reuse it. It was not. And of course, if you are somewhat directly woven into the core of an S4 system with your custom code, then maybe the technical debt is higher. So that is CleanCore on the meta level. Let's dive now into the details. What does it mean in, you could say, reality? And we have 5 dimensions on this. And as we are not very typical, we start with number 2. Why? Because we have in the center 3 technical dimensions: extensibility, data, and integration. What does it mean to be clean for extensibility? We'll deep dive in this in a second, or deep dive in quotation marks, because it will be just a few minutes, but we will look deeper into this. But generally, the idea is to have every extension, every custom code in a way that it's decoupled, maybe physically by running in a separate runtime environment, maybe only logically by running within your core, but by not harming the core itself. So for example, no modification or no access to SAP objects that are maybe changing in the next version. So we will see that in a second. Quite a lot is about that SAP offers now local and remote APIs that will stay stable. That's important. But it's not only extensibility. For me and my projects, what I've seen rather quickly is that integration is key part of that as well. If you do an integration with your system and some external system out there, then it's important that you do this on reliable and at the same time flexible interfaces, and reliable in a way that if you do an upgrade, for example, from one version of S/4HANA to the next one, that you only choose integration scenarios or interfaces that are guaranteed stable from SAP point of view. So maybe do not create your own ones where you do not know what's all like a related object or a reference object below that, where you're not sure if is all of that fine. But we offer as SAP interfaces that are promised to be kept stable. And if you do that, all of your extensions only on released interfaces, all of your integration on that, your system is a lot cleaner. And if you would start with Greenfield and keep your system 100% to this, the next upgrade will be a lot easier. It will not go away. It will not be like in public cloud. And even in public cloud, you will do some testing, I guess, but it will be a lot easier. And maybe upgrade cycles will no longer be 5-7 years or more. Why do we have data in there? Basically, you can only, or there are several aspects to this dimension of data. For me, two important things to this is, first, thinking in my extension and my custom code world, I was with the customer having a massive S4 instance running already on S4, but having 30 terabyte of data. And then just by the way, while we were chatting around during a workshop, they mentioned like, yeah, and 40% of these 30 terabyte are custom tables, are Z tables. That was kind of impressive. Every backup you make, every upgrade you make, every time you work with your system, you have 40% of this huge chunk of data that's custom data. Is it all needed in the core? Maybe, maybe not. So you could think of, is it really clean to put all of the data for your extensions in the core if it's not really needed? Maybe it's not. Fortunately, I clicked here, so we'll go back to this one. And then the second view on data for me is data needs to be clean as well from a content point of view. If you want to do cool things with AI, for example, it's all based on data, and data is like the new oil, it's often stated. And if your data, if your master data, if your, for example, vendors, customers, so your business partners, your product master data is not really clean, then maybe lots of the stuff that you could do with AI, where lots of data is analyzed and then some cool stuff is happening, cannot be done. So data has different aspects. And if you think of this picture like, my system needs to be clean in the real sense of the word, you would say if you have too much unused data in there or incorrect data, I wouldn't call your system clean. On top of this, we have, and that's going through all of the other technical dimensions, the process dimension. Am I doing the right thing? So can I keep competitiveness while reducing complexity? It says here, why? If I have some really differentiating function that is not an SAP standard, and I need this, and this is really making the difference for me, it's fine to have it. But sometimes complexity is growing for, you could say, historic reasons, because we always did it this way. Maybe there was not this functionality available back then, so we built something on our own. Or sometimes it's simple things that you start, like you merge with another company and they have 5 different kinds of sales order types, you have 5, and then you end up with 10 instead of looking at, are we doing the right thing? So it's important, and it plays into all of the technical dimensions that you ask, do we really need this integration or extensibility scenario? Can't we do this in standard? And the bottom line for all of this is operations, because only if this idea and the governance we just talked about is put into place into your operation concept, it's working. To be precise, if you have a nice governance around this is how extensibility should be working in future, to have all new custom code in the clean way, if there is no way to really control and steer this in operations, if there is no automated check, if it's just like, yeah, we try to, but okay, if there is no governance process really lived and operated, it's not worth the paper where it's on. Because then you will have no clear exemption process or exception process. If there is something where you need to work around some maybe missing API. So it's really important to have that put in place in a stable way. So what does it mean? To all of these dimensions, CleanCore is relevant. For the three dimensions in the middle, extensibility, data, and integration, a strong governance is key. And this should be put in place with operations. And of course, also for like doing the right things from a process point of view, governance is also important. But there it's maybe more difficult to put this into guidelines. I will not go into every detail of every of these dimensions, but just to give you an idea, what we do have is we have an overview for all of the dimensions. And I would start with processes and then dive a bit deeper into the extensibility one before we then maybe get back to, okay, and how do we do this? How do we put this into practical life in reality? So what's the main aspect? And this is how these slides always work. We have focus on blue business processes, and then we have the main aspects. What are the main aspects for processes when it comes to CleanCore? And it's kind of important to say this, but there we come back to the mindset and the idea of CleanCore. This needs to be put in place in the organizational structure of your company. So for example, to create something like a solution standardization board, as we call it in Activate, to say that we have a board where we decide, is it really worth doing this change to standard, or where we even analyze, is this requirement solvable in standard? At the same time, it's also about to say, we want to, for example, formulate in a process design the to-be processes, to say like, okay, where do we want to go? What's kind of differentiating for us? Where can we maybe leverage best practices processes? And that's kind of important to say like, okay, where do we want to go? How do we map this business requirement to then our processes, our systems? And I think that's a big part. For me as technician, I have to admit, I'm always late to this party. When I come in, and this is the next dimension, I'm the one for extensibility, but there is a direct connect to what we can see in how do you do extensions in a CleanCore way. The first point already tells you, avoid extensions whenever possible. Of course, it's easy to say, but I have to admit that's a process decision. And maybe one of our executives, Steffen Peach, well known in the user groups, will be also on the Sapphire next week on stage, and a big expert on CleanCore. He's often referring to, we're building golden balconies for our internal customers. He was with a customer, with a company, and he was managing the SAP system. And I see this at companies as well, that often that's a good thing that you serve your customer, your business process owners, and that you want to do this. But sometimes you invest maybe too much into a part that's not differentiating enough. So that's why we say avoid extensions when possible. That's not a decision I can take as technician. So let's assume this was checked. There's nothing in standard. It's needed. It's differentiating. We need it. So what are the next steps? First things first, strong governance. And you could say CleanCore is governance, governance, governance. What do we want to achieve? We want to create decoupled extensions in a way that they would work in the cloud. They do not need to work directly in the cloud. They do not need to run in BTP, but we want to keep this in mind, because if we work in a way that it would work in cloud, where we have the upgrades every 6 months, the stability is built in. How do you do this? By separating extensions from the core, from the SAP standard objects, by exclusively and only using released APIs. This could be done locally. So we have local APIs like CDS views for reading data, business object interfaces, we call them, to change data. And the goal then is to say, okay, custom extensions do not break an upgrade, and vice versa, upgrades do not break an extension. So whenever you do an upgrade, your extension will still be working, and your upgrade process itself is not stopped through, for example, SPAU, SPAU, SBDD, and all of this stuff. That's the ultimate goal. Important for this is that you can say, okay, it's not only happening on BTP, and that's why I mentioned it. It's also possible on the stack. We have in ABAP a new language version where you can like switch the language version, and then automatically you say, okay, this piece of this class, for example, is by design upgrade stable. Even if there is an API missing, there are mitigation concepts around that. So kind of a powerful concept. And what is the other part of that? It will not always happen that you can be 100% clean. So maybe you're extending an existing ALV application in your sub GUI. Maybe you can do some things good, but maybe you don't want to rebuild everything to Fiori or something like that. Maybe SAP is not offering the right interfaces that you need to do your stuff. There's only a function module, not released all of this. This might happen, but if this happens, we come back to governance. There should be a process in place that this happens only as an informed decision. And then it's fine if you know, like, these are my exception cases. And here I am fine because for me, this is important. Even in greenfield scenarios that have a high focus on CleanCore, I was already involved in projects where we agreed on, on creating extensions, including a real technical modification. If there's nothing better, nothing else, and this is differentiating for you, if the alternative is you stop your business in a certain area or in a certain country, then it's fine to build a modification, but it needs to be an informed decision and not like, yeah, I did this exactly that way 10 years ago, so we'll just continue to do so. So there is a learning curve for the developers out there. As mentioned, this is like the first level of detail. We also have for these main aspects, you might remember them from the last slide, also a detailed version of this. You will get the slides afterwards. I will not read through this, but just to show you like, okay, how do you do this? For example, on governance, ideally you have something in place where you say like, we have custom development only if there is nothing in standard, that you have something like a fit to standard approach, that you have guidance that tells you want to have clean options over unclean ones. For us, for example, we would recommend the extension methodology. It's linked in here that can give you, and maybe I just show what it is like, that you can see, okay, there is a general idea on this, but on top of this, we also have the, let's say, real assets. So for extensibility, we have the extension methodology, has several phases. I won't go into every detail, but just to give you an idea, the key part for me is that you create something like this, a color coding to say like, hey, for example, we call it the extension task, I want to create a new UI. What's the right way to do so? What's my clean option? How do I prefer it? And maybe I do some color coding, and maybe this color coding has a clear meaning to say like, if it's red, then you need to get approval from a central design board or from the CIO or from the chief project lead or from some, let's say, governance body. So you can see there is something out there. It's not just like, yeah, CleanCore is just a concept. No, but I also have to admit it's kind of a quite amount of work to look like, where does it fit to my process? I hope you already have some kind of governance process, and depending on the size of your company, if you have like maybe 20 developers, you do not need to have a very strict governance in a sense of a very formal one. But of course, it's different. I'm working now with a customer that has several thousand of developers working on SAP systems. Then you cannot say like, hey, we just come together and we decide together on every stuff. No, then it needs to be more formal. And how does this fit into your world? At the same time, it's important to say you need to create awareness, and you need to know that there are ways, for example, to request APIs and to know how to build wrappers and to learn all of the, let's say, new approaches. Just to give you a picture on this, the extensibility portfolio for S/4HANA, and right now it's cloud, public cloud. I will have one click and then it's even on premises and private cloud, is that we have options on the stack, either more low code-ish or pro code-ish, and side by side. And basically the important thing is to say, if you have something that's closely coupled, that really belongs on the stack, there are clean options compared to what we had before, the classic extensibility. So creating a modification, creating a report in SE38 where you directly update any SAP table, it's not considered clean. But there are comparable, we could say, successor technologies to do this. RAP plays a big part in that on the stack. And that's important to understand. At the same time, it's the question of, and it's mentioned in the slide on how to do CleanCore. It's not only BTP, but at the same time, it's totally making sense. And I would even push one step further and say, like, whenever an extension can be built on BTP, this should be the default option. Why? Because then you separate by design. you're separated in a separate, your own runtime. And if you only integrate through released APIs, then these will stay stable. And basically, you don't care if your S4 is upgraded or not. Of course, you will test it. But over time, you might get some confidence in saying, like, okay, maybe we do not need to test every effort and everything in there. Maybe we know that there's trust in general part in there. And maybe this increases our ability to upgrade. Maybe it's not just training, what colleagues sometimes call the upgrade muscle, and just doing it. Maybe you can also optimize in how to do this. One part of this, to close down on this extensibility part with the last picture, and I like this quite a lot, is, okay, and what kind of assets do we have out there? And I have put this here. Technically, it wasn't me. I've taken this slide from colleagues of us, I have to admit. But we have this nice overview that tells you, like, okay, what is the typical decision criteria to go on an extension on stack or side by side? And compared to the typical decision trees that you sometimes see, I like this one because it's like, you can have scenarios that have a true or a check mark on both ends. And then it's always a decision on, like, what's weighing in more. So is performance more critical, or is it maybe scalability, or is it the strong consistency that is needed? And based on this, it's difficult to have this in a generic way, but this is like our approach to say, okay, a good collection of reasons when to go on stack and when to go side by side. As mentioned, you will get the slides, but just to give you a short overview on what's out there, I have linked the BTP guidance framework in the end. And I will just move that over. The BTP guidance framework is a key part in this kind of, you could say, helping you, at least for extensibility and integration, on how to get there. And you can see here, there is some extension architecture guide, it is called. And why am I showing this? Because in here we have different chapters. And one is called extension use case patterns. And if you look now closely, you can see there are good reasons to do something on the stack, and there are good reasons to do something side by side with BTP. And these are basically the reasons, with some cool links behind, so a bit more than just a PowerPoint slide. But that's the idea, that we give you something at hand that you can use for yourself. And maybe you have some other reasons to do something on the stack or side by side, maybe legal requirements in different countries or legal requirements based on your industry. That's all good. So you can enhance it, but that you don't have to start from scratch. So what does it mean? CleanCore for extensibility. This is how we got into these details. Basically, it is, you can do it on the stack with released APIs. That's like a new thing. We do the new ABAP. We often call it, from a programming perspective, ABAP Cloud. Or you do it side by side with BTP. We have both options. The idea of both is to logically decouple your code, your custom extension, from the core. And that's then the trick to make things upgrade stable. So let's come back to, we started this with the overview, the different dimensions that we still have. I already mentioned these points for data. So it's about data quality, data volume as well. Maybe you can get rid of a massive amount of your data. That might be helpful if you can just get rid of maybe 10% of your data, because your data volume can be managed better. And of course, it's also about, often put in here as well, what do you do with personal master data? So we all know this, the data protection laws in the EU. How do you cover this? I admit there is no direct impact to the upgradability, for example, of some of these points. But if we think of the big picture, you want to innovate and you want to be able to innovate. For example, data quality is rather important. Let's get to the final of this. What is CleanCore with the missing components? Integration, and there I want to only point out a few things. Basically, the concept is the same. Go for integrations based on standard APIs. Where do you find them? There are different approaches, of course, but the easiest one is go for api.sap.com. It's now called the Business Accelerator Hub. And then you can check, for example, for S/4HANA Cloud Private Edition, what kind of APIs do we have? Maybe an OData. Maybe I want to check here, and then I can look in there. These are APIs that you can use. I just mentioned for extensibility, we also have this kind of APIs. You can use either these ones for side-by-side extensibility or the local ones that are in here in developer extensibility. Just to close this picture, it's kind of connected, and api.sap.com is the place where you can find this. Of course, you can also find it in your system, but let's stick on the overview level here. So in general, the idea then is to go through these standard APIs, because if an API is listed in our official place for that, and it's officially released, then this will stay stable. That's like the guarantee from SAP. And if you do not select from the tables themselves, but if you go through this API, even if SAP changes something in the data model, you do not have to take care of this. SAP will do, because we promise this API is released, we will not change it incompatibly. Another big option is you could go for an event-driven design. And if you want to have like some more complex scenarios, maybe Integration Suite is helping you. And to be very clear, traditional APIs, RFC and IDOC, are classic extension options and classic integration options, and we want to try to avoid them. Of course, even in S/4HANA Public Cloud, there are IDOCs that you can use, even RFC or function modules that can be used. But if you create something on your own, something new, this is maybe not the future-looking technology you want to dive in. And you can see it here, Application Interface Framework, AIF, is also the go-to tool when it comes to proper monitoring. For operations, this is for me a big point, because you can basically put everything in there. Here, when we put together this kind of definition, we had kind of the idea, release management should make up the foundation for a CleanCore. What does it mean? That you have a clear process on how to do release management, but also something like a contractual maintenance period where you say like upfront, this is when I want to do the next upgrade or the next maintenance period in general, that you have this. But the most important part for me is you need to keep this idea and paradigm of CleanCore in your end-to-end concept for operations. For example, by having automated code checks before you release a transport request in Extensibility, or by having automated tests, or by having set up a process that is doing the housekeeping for data or for integration scenarios or for Extensibility every now and then, that you say like every year or every second year, I check on unused code if I can get rid of this, because this is kind of cleaning your house and really useful. So operations is a big topic, and also lots of the governance part plays in here as well. Now, coming back from the different dimensions, and you've seen the different colors, where does this bring us? And basically, you could say typically on a big picture, we have the starting position. And this is a lot like a digital thing, like 1 and 0, good and bad. Maybe for you, it's not completely like this, but this is the picture to show you, okay, this is the beginning state and the end state, although there is never an end, because typically, I will come to that, CleanCore will not simply happen overnight. But the idea is that you come from a system where you maybe have a lot of extensions on the stack, even modifications, unclean extensions, maybe unused extensions, a large amount of data, and you can see and remember the colors that we just had, complex processes and complex integration we come to, and that's not a big surprise now, but we come to this picture to say like, okay, we want to have the core S4 simplified, ideally close to best practices processes if they match. Extensions, and this little arrow or this little line here shows it's on the same stack, it's in the same application server, you could say, but it's separated logically. There is no modification or stuff like that. And we have extensions side by side as well. The same for data, that wherever possible, you go for data side by side, and the same for integration, that you have integration patterns to the outside world, for example, with the templates we have in our cloud integration environment. So this is like the target state, but there are different ways to get there. And now let's assume we go this path from ERP or ECC to S4. Where and how can I then do this kind of transformation? Typically, what we do here is we show this by being a bit pseudo-scientific. It's not real science, but it should give you an idea of what could be your goal. So if we look now, we have the time on the x-axis here, and on the y-axis to the top, we have the number of deviations from CleanCore. For example, a modification, a bad interface, all of this collected as an imaginary number. And if you look at this right now, you go on, if you would continue classically, the complexity would grow and grow more and more. This is what we see at customer systems. If you have 50,000 custom code objects right now, and you just continue, it's very likely that 2 years from now, you maybe have 60,000 or 70,000 custom code objects. And at the same time, you have the same amount or comparably grown the, let's say, deviation from CleanCore. So what are the different options you have? You could go, while you're moving to S4HANA, for a greenfield approach. For me as a technician, that's the nicest possibility that we could go for. Why? Because you do not take over all of your old code. You just throw it away. Basically, you do a new fit to standard, and every extension, at least in theory, in a new implementation greenfield project, is done anew. What does it mean? You need to keep the core clean. How do you do this? By good development guidelines, by choosing good architectures, by choosing the right extensibility and integration stack, all of this. You will not reach zero when it comes to technical debt, but you will do a big jump. At the same time, the time to realize this will be quite long, because greenfield takes its time. You need to consider all of the processes, but this is like a huge step forward. The other big scenario that we often see is brownfield. And there we have the same activities, but split up in a different way. And that's an important point for me. Even there, you can say, keep the core clean. That's the area here where it's straight, parallel to the x-axis. Why? If you're in a brownfield scenario, if you are able to ensure that every new development is, or new extension, and every new integration scenario and all of this is done the CleanCore way, you will at least not create new technical debt, or only in a controlled way. At the same time, you can consider, are there possibilities to make your core clean? For example, can I delete unused code prior to my S4 conversion? Totally making sense. But still, you need to delete code. Often people and projects are hesitant to do so. Or can I identify a piece of code, of custom code, for example, that's especially painful? Every upgrade, I know that's a huge pain. Maybe you can have this kind of lighthouse effect that you say, and this one, we really rebuild it completely. And that's really useful to do that. But what you can see is, while you directly have then the impact and the time to go live is not that long, this will take you longer to get clean. And maybe, just to give you an idea, if you now have 50,000 custom code objects that are not clean, it will not be 2 years from now and everything will be clean. It should be a smart way of doing so. Of course, there are some things you can already do in ECC, but we have to be fair. It's somewhat limited. Getting rid of unused code, yes, but these new extension scenarios I've just shown, on-stack extensibility is not there. What does it mean for the transformation and for CleanCore in general? A CleanCore roadmap can really differ between different companies or different, let's say, systems, even within the same company. If you have a greenfield initiative here, the focus on CleanCore, to keep the core clean and to do everything the new way, is totally helpful. Whereas here, this is also important, but you also need to look at what's my impact. If I only look at new development, how much new development do we have? Can I push for something like that? If you have a mixed form, I saw a question that's out there for what about Bluefield? That really depends on how you set up your Bluefield, because often Bluefield, or selective data transition as it is called, is taking, for example, all of the custom code or only parts of it. And then it really depends on, are you more from a code perspective to a system conversion or to a new implementation scenario? Typically, whenever you take something over, the value is limited in really creating it from scratch. So even the greenfield scenarios I've seen often have like a backdoor where you bring in some old existing extensions if it was an ABAP-based system before. So how do you bring this to life and keep the core clean is kind of the activity that you need in both. And I just want to show you how this could look like and give you a short outlook into what we have in there, or also in standard material out there. So in our Activate methodology, we have a governance board called Solution Standardization Board. I can show the link in a second, but the idea is to have a central governance board where that ideally also owns extension guidelines, integration guidelines, and data guidelines. And looking now at an extensibility request, for me, a good governance process could look like this. Of course, it's really subject to the detailed situation, if it's like this or a bit different. Ideally, you have your guidelines based on our methodologies, like the extension methodologies, and a functional request and gap comes in. And then you decide, is it bringing any value to us? Is it worth looking deeper into this? If yes, based on your guidelines, you create a high-level architecture that says, will it be green or not? And then you basically need to go back like, okay, is it still worth it? If I need to do a lot of modifications, do we still want to have it? Maybe, maybe not. At the same time, after you have the architecture, you also need, that's why we go through this yellow box again, guidelines or guides for implementation. Good rules that give you like, okay, go for this kind of naming convention, prefer RAP over classic development, stuff like that if you do it on stack, or what kind of engine should be used if you're side by side. Should it be with Java, Node.js? Should it be Cloud Foundry? They need something hands-on. What's important for me and why I created this little picture here and wanted to share it with you, it's important to close the loop, because once you do the implementation, sometime later you will have the deployment. In ABAP, we would say you release the transport request. Ideally, the bottom dimension, the operations part, comes in as well. And you have something set up like, for example, in ABAP, it would be an automated code check with our ABAP test cockpit. And only if there are no issues known, you allow this deployment. Technically, you block the transport as long as there is a finding in your ABAP test cockpit. And if there's something blocking, there can be exceptions, of course, but this should be closing the loop, that this is only happening if you're agreeing to what you decided in your governance board. There is kind of a lot of material out there. I mentioned it already in the Activate methodology. And let me show this to you. The Activate methodology, this is the roadmap viewer for this, for sub-Activate. And if you look into explore all roadmaps, there's one, it's called the Activate methodology for RISE with S/4HANA Cloud Private Edition. This is where this was kind of piloted and where the biggest part is in. And you can see there are kind of a lot of things. There's, for example, also the idea of setting up this solution standardization board. What I want to point out is there's even a quality gate at the end of each phase, or yeah, it's called phase, end of discover, end of prepare, where you have all of your stuff done. And you can see there's a quality gate. And that's really useful, because then you can say, okay, for a new implementation, what are things you can consider? And it even gives you a questionnaire to go through. And you can see here, for example, for extensibility, do you plan to create development guidelines following the CleanCore principles? And then you can answer yes or no, or I don't know. And it gives you a good direction on, are we on the right path? If you are in a RISE project, so in a private cloud project, you can even send this Excel out to SAP and you will receive a report that gives you like hints to the right direction. So just to let you know, this is not like just an idea. There's kind of a lot of material out there, but still coming back now, okay, what does it mean for you? There are a few key points I want to finish with, and I want to like make sure to say, okay, this is the core of it. One thing is we had mindset, we had everything around. Journey is missing. No, it's not. Sorry for the harsh words. It's not bullshit bingo for marketing, but it is. CleanCore is nothing that will happen overnight. In Greenfield, be aware that this is a unique opportunity. You will not start the next Greenfield project 10 years from now or 5 years from now. So I would say governance is very, very important, of utmost importance for me, because it's the possibility that by setting the rules in a tough way now, have a real clean system. Otherwise, you just have a new system that, speaking in this little graph we had before, is going up and up and up again, and then it's like not really a cool thing. At the same time, maybe you're more in brownfield-ish scenario. For new developments, still, it's making sense to get in there. But it's there also important for me to say, okay, for the get clean part, plan your journey in an iterative way, use case by use case. And please do not expect that a system where you maybe developed something in, let's say, the unclean way or the classic way for 10 years or even more, it will not happen overnight that this is automatically taken away. Not all of the complexity or the, let's say, interwoven custom code with SAP standard will be resolved within weeks. But it should be a journey that you plan on and where you have clear goals that you say like, hey, maybe the most painful parts we start with. So what are the key takeaways then of this? Why do we need CleanCore? Why do we need 5 dimensions to this? Basically, you could say CleanCore is a bit like the prerequisite to follow this business change in an agile way. It is a holistic picture. And you could say it's like the collection of best practices in ERP. Not everything is new just because we now put it under the umbrella of CleanCore. It was always better to use an extension point from SAP, like a body, instead of a modification. We just now added maybe here and there are some new layers to that we now have local APIs, stuff like that. But these are for me the key takeaways to say, okay, CleanCore is the concept and the strategy that's more than just extensibility. And if you practice this consequently, then this is a good starting point. What's next then after this session? And maybe you feel like, okay, where do I start? I put in here some links to that could be a good starting point. One is, and I already mentioned it, the guidance framework. There's kind of a lot of things in there. If you're a development guy like I am, an extension person, then maybe you're interested in the details. I already mentioned we have local APIs. There is a nice white paper out there. It's called Extend SAP S/4HANA in the cloud and on-premise with ABAP-based extension, a bit lengthy maybe, but this is like the one document you should read if you're a developer and you want to get into the new world of extensibility and CleanCore. Of course, there's a lot out there like learning journeys, etc., but this is a good starting point. And thirdly, the extension methodology I've shown. It's also part of the center that I've just shown. So it's all connected. It's part of the guidance framework, but it's really useful to maybe pimp up your own guidelines. And with this is kind of the good part where I can say, okay, maybe that's your homework now to get into this. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to open up the round for questions. I've seen there is already a question, so maybe I will tackle this one at first, and then we can check if there's some more question. The first question is, or the one that we have of a colleague or an attendee in general. I've seen some colleagues talking about one more element in these 5 rules called software version, a 6th dimension. Yes, it's sometimes still out there, and you could argue quite a lot that we have, besides of the 5 dimensions as here, also one called software version or software stack. For me, this is basically the result that we're all aiming for. If you are good in these in operations integration, data extensibility, and business processes, you will be on the newest release. And that's like the 6th dimension. Sometimes it's displayed separately because it's nice to measure. If you want to measure CleanCore, it's the easiest part to measure, like, hey, what version are you on? And if you say then maybe 2023, S/4HANA 2023, then it's like thumbs up. That's a good sign because you did recently an upgrade. So I think that's an fair point. Content-wise, there is no difference. And I admit, I would love to see that we harmonize on this, but you know, we're 100,000 people, so we're getting there. Then we have a question, sounds easy, but what if the competitive advantage is in the customization that were created by the company's developers? True point. So ideally, of course, you have a pure standard system, but this will not work because you want to have your competitive advantage. And for me, this is like why we point out, okay, whenever possible, avoid the extension, but then follow this kind of governance. And you can still say, yes, go for the extensions. You can still do it. Technically, I would say it's part of in this picture, the solution standardization board to decide, is it worth going into this gap and doing something if there is nothing in standard, if there is classic make or buy, is there something out there, or do we need to build something on our own? But then it's important that you follow these guidelines to be as clean as possible. There might be exceptions that you have a missing API, that it needs to be kind of nasty somewhere or unclean, fine. But I would still say, and that's why I would say also in Brownfit, for example, it's not making sense to revamp everything because you typically don't create ABAP code just for fun. There's always a business reason behind that. So keep it and then over the time improve it and see that you get better on that. But yes, it's still the idea that we have extension points and that you can extend the standard process wherever it's making sense for you. I think with this question, we hit the top of the hour.
All right. Thank you a lot, Lukas. Very interesting session. Please be informed that as usual, you will get the PowerPoint and you will get the recording after it. If you close now the session, please be aware that you will get 3 questions where I would kindly ask you to answer. It's a question around how do you like the session and so on. Please do that. That helps us to improve ourselves, or in that case, I don't think we need an improvement, but anyways, I would be very thankful if you could do that. With that, thank you all, and we'll hear us next week. And thank especially to you, Lukas, and have a rest of the day, and hear you later next week. Goodbye.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye-bye.